morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for February 5th, 2021. I'd like to begin by just urging you to look at the dialogue I did yesterday with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. It's our weekly dialogue, and one of the topics we took up, or actually we took up a number of topics, but we opened and closed with the basis for what could be a guarded optimism for a change in the overall strategic direction, related to two things. One is the willingness of Russia and China to provide vaccines not just to poorer countries, but even to countries like Germany and Italy, Serbia. This is a positive development. It's a step toward cooperation of nations toward building a new world health system, the need for which was desperately exposed with the outbreak of the COVID pandemic. And we concluded with the discussion of the importance of the return to space, with 3 missions to Mars this week from the United Arab Emirates, from China, and the United States. And so I'd urge you to look at that webcast. We also talked about the dangers, the provocations against Russia around Navalny, the Atlantic Council's new report on China. But it's a very thorough report on where we stand strategically, and it's well worth your time to look at it. You can find it at theschillerinstitute.com. Now, there are some questions today, and again, there were more questions this week than I have time to answer, but I picked out a few of the representative ones. One of which, the first one is, are we on a course toward war with Russia and China? There are several variations of this question, but I think the answer is clear that if you look at the Biden administration, it's a war administration. People who were involved in pushing the wars of the Bush and the Obama-Biden administrations. Biden himself is a war hawk. I just wrote an article, which will be up on my blog site probably by the latest Sunday or Monday, on the Biden default back to the Obama war policy. But what's clear is that with the Atlantic Council report referring to China as an aggressive nation that must be contained, the document called the Longer Telegram, which is a reference back to the Cold War initiation with the 1946 telegram from George Kennan, that's a very ominous approach. Also, Biden himself with his comments to Putin, where while he did agree to a New START treaty, an extension of the START treaty, at the same time he lectured Putin about anti-democratic forces in regards to the Navalny case, the solar winds, the possible cancellation of Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and so on. Now, adding to this, let me just read you something or give you a sense of something from Admiral Charles Richard, who's the head of the U.S. Strategic Command. He said the United States must go for a crash modernization of its nuclear weapons capability because of the likelihood of an impending nuclear war with Russia and China. And to head it off, we must have new weapons that are such that it would deter the use of any nuclear weapons. Well, what's the basis of a nuclear war with Russia and China? What are they doing that's a threat? You have the new Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, who said that the danger to us is that China is ascending, and so therefore it's a threat to us. Well, why should we be threatened by other countries advancing and developing? And he also said that Russia's a threat because it's descending. This is the same old British geopolitics, which is coming back into full swing under Biden. And this represents a very dangerous threat to the United States and to the world. And the second question, which I can't give you a full answer to, but what is behind the coup in Myanmar and the jailing of Aun Suu Kyii, who was not so long ago the darling of the human rights mafia? Well, she was brought in what was essentially a regime change coup, but was given no tools to change the situation within Myanmar. What's the problem there? It's the same problem you have throughout South Asia. You don't have economic development on the scale necessary to lift people out of poverty. And so whatever government is in charge is going to end up engaging in policies on behalf of the banks, on behalf of the IMF, which will worsen the situation for people. And you've had the Rohingya crisis there, you've had other things, the inability without real aid or cooperation to provide for a better standard of living. Now, there's also obviously some relationship here to China. The Chinese were offering to do some help with Myanmar. I can't give you the full answer on that, but I think the important thing is that regime change coups are never the solution. The solution rests with international cooperation and the breaking of the existing model of the International Monetary Fund and the global banks, and replacing it with Lyndon LaRouche's idea of a new Bretton Woods, which would fund economic development, especially infrastructure, as well as scientific and technological advance in the poorest countries in the world. If you don't have that, you're going to go through an endless procession of new governments with promises that can't be delivered. And in the disappointments, you create the basis for not just new coups, but also the danger of wars. Now, next question, what do you mean by corporate fascism? Well, originally, fascism was defined as government by corporations that act over and above any elected governments. This was the model with Mussolini. This was actually done for Hitler in Germany, organized by cartel arrangements from New York bankers such as Roland Harriman and Prescott Bush, through British banks led by Montague Norman, the head of the Bank of England. Interesting, because the coup to establish a global bankers dictatorship today is directed in part by Mark Carney, who was the former chairman of the Bank of England. So there's a British connection with corporate fascism going back to its beginnings in the 1920s. Now, in the late 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt was pulling together an intelligence team to look at how to deal with the situation with fascism, they put together a report which defined the policy as synarchism, which they said was the intersection of socialism and fascist policy under the control of an oligarchy that acted over and above the interests of the people and controlled the institutions of the state, basically through emergency decrees. Now, what we're seeing today with corporate fascism is the signing of free trade agreements, of the push for the funding of a series of speculative bubbles, while deindustrializing the economies of the West, of the transatlantic region, creating a growing number of unemployed people, people employed by the gig economy who don't make enough money to survive, and having increasing control by the private banks acting through central banks to make the policy. In other words, your vote doesn't matter. Whoever you elect, their say has no value, because the policy is going to be made by technocrats answering to the central bankers who answer to the private interests of financial cartels, of grain cartels, of raw material cartels, of big pharma, and so on. That's what corporate fascism is. And we're seeing the move directly to that with the so-called Great Reset of Davos and Klaus Schwab and the Green New Deal. Who's the titular head of this thing? Prince Charles. Once again, the British Empire, as it was with the role of Montague Norman imposing shock on the German people through Hitler's emergency decrees, Schacht was the one who ran the cartel economy. And Lyndon LaRouche in 1971 warned that if Nixon went ahead with what became the break with the Bretton Woods system, we would be heading down the path toward a new fascism done along the lines of the Schachtian policy. And what do we see? Well, just as Prescott Bush was there at the beginning of the Nazi coup that brought Hitler to power and ended up with an economy run by Schacht, which literally worked people to death in the concentration camps. His son, Prescott Bush's son, George Herbert Walker Bush, became the president, and then George W. Bush, his grandson, became president. George W. Bush presided over the emergency decrees that established the Patriot Act after the Reichstag fire event of 9/11. So this is what we mean by corporate fascism. And this is what we're seeing today with the alliance of the Davos billionaires, with Wall Street, with the City of London, and with the European Union. That's corporate fascism. Now, finally, I was asked by someone who said that she basically reached the conclusion that the attacks on Lyndon LaRouche represented maybe one of the first cases of cancel culture, the attempt to cancel the ideas associated with Mr. LaRouche and his movement through slander and not covering them, ignoring them. And she asked the question, well, basically, what is the purpose of cancel culture? Well, this is an obvious point, maybe not so obvious to people who are caught up within it. But the idea is that if you give the power to certain groups to wipe out the input from any other groups, then you can control them. Now, this can be done from the top down, but it's actually more effective if you do it in little groups, groups of friends, groups of like-minded individuals, ethnic groups, religious groups, racial groups, where you blot out any challenge to the groupthink which is imposed to keep these groups separate and fighting other groups. What better way to control a society than to have small groups with narrow identities fighting all the other small groups with narrow identities for a little piece of a shrinking pie? That's the whole British gang counter-gang strategy. And cancel culture, as we see it, well, when it's applied to Hollywood types and the social mavens, people kind of look at it and say, oh, that's really ridiculous. But we don't realize that's what our whole politics today is based on. That's what this last election was about, identity politics. And if you didn't go along with the groupthink, you would be written out. Now we see it in the form of censorship coming from the same big tech firms whose social media specializes in cancel culture through its likes and dislikes, thumbs up and thumbs down, which is designed not just to manipulate you into liking something, accepting something, but actually into changing the way you think, as Edward Snowden has pointed out. So this is a crucial question, and it gets to another question that came to me that I really liked, but I just didn't have the time to prepare for it. Someone asked me, what does Nicholas of Cusa, the great 15th century religious leader, scientist, and philosopher, mean by truth? Now, this is obviously a reference to Helga Zepp-LaRouche's discussion of the coincidence of opposites as the way you achieve a higher understanding than having the equivalent of different identity groups fighting on preconceived ideas or accepted axioms. And I'll take this up at a later date when I have more time, but I very much appreciated that question. And you can find more about it by going to the Schiller Institute website, where we have a section on the coincidence of opposite commission, which is taking up the question of how we can bring together the world around the necessity for a new world health system to address not just the COVID crisis, but future such pandemics, which will occur unless we have a modern healthcare system in every nation. So thank you for your questions. Thanks for joining me this week. As I said, look for my article coming up on my blog page. If you're not already a subscriber to the LaRouche Organization, go to the LaRoucheOrganization.com and you'll see a box that says sign in. Just click on that, sign up, and become a member. And if you can, make a contribution. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you again on Monday.